I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. So, welcome to Season 2, Episode 2, and which is just exciting in and of itself that we've actually gotten past Season 1, and this is a thing that's continuing on, which is...
It's a tradition now.
It is. It's a quarter-annual tradition. Is it every 4 years? Every
You
3
might
years?
even say it's an institution.
You might say it's an institution.
Yeah.
Since you bring up institutions, why don't you start with giving us? I think that's what we'll talk about for this episode. Is what are institutions? What role do they play in society? Is there still a need for them, et cetera? How do they fit into a conservative worldview? So why don't you start by giving us an overview of what you see as institution? What is an institution? Why does it exist?
What is it to me?
Yes. What is an institution to you?
Well, first, I'll just acknowledge, I think the word is kind of taken on baggage in our time.
Yes.
There's a widespread cynicism on a lot of different fronts of big government or just controlling social norms and morals, etc.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of people from a lot of different directions taking pot shots at social institutions on a wide variety of levels. But what's this, social institutions have always reflected is just people coming together. It's the social fabric,
Right.
and the tapestry of American life. When Democracy in America was written by de Tocqueville, he's this French social commentator who comes to America and travels across this baby country, and he comments on what makes it unique and, in his mind, special. And he attributes so much of our success and our flourishing as a free society on the existence of these social institutions. And we're talking about everything between subsidiarism and government.
Yeah.
The fact that we have a federal system with a central government and states and local governments and counties, but also like having a bowling club downtown and having a Rotary Club today. And this wasn't true for de Tocqueville.
I don't know about how much bowling was going on with Tocqueville. I'm sure he packed his ball when he came over from France. But
I thought of bowling because there's also a Bowling Alone.
Yes,
It
great
picks
book.
up on this. But the fact that you have people doing things together and that knits the fabric and the fibers of the social tapestry. So that, I mean, what are we really talking about? We're talking about relationships.
Right.
Dedicated relationships that are kind of purpose-driven towards the flourishing of the community and the individuals and the life of the citizens.
Have you played Monopoly?
Yeah, of course.
So what are the two cards that you can draw in Monopoly? The two main decks that set right on top.
What is it?
It's Chance
Chance
and
then Life or something?
Community Chest.
Community Chest.
When was the last time anyone here has ever heard of a Community Chest being a thing?
That's a
It's
good
not.
point.
It's not a thing anymore, right?
Yeah.
And it's because, and we'll talk about this. I don't want to get ahead of us, but we'll talk about this too. That we liberals on the left, not classical liberals, but neoliberals, have taken the local responsibility of church, of family, of local government, and tried to make it a national program, right? So there's no longer that community chest of, hey, I'm gonna donate to my local charity that is helping the local folks in need. Because I care about my neighbor, I care about my community, I care about the kids that my kids go to school with, because this is my sphere of influence, right? My local sphere of influence. We've lost a lot of that. Now there's still a ton of that goes on, right? Yeah. But if we look at what is the primary mode of assistance for people in need today, and it's the federal government, right? Which is a shame. And I think the church has lost a lot of that. Both by abdication and just by things being taken from them. Regulations have been put into place, supposedly for the public good, right? Like a soup kitchen today is, in my opinion, slightly over-regulated. Like a church just can't go open up their back doors and feed people. And to me, that's a travesty. We've lost something there. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think that's
not at all
something that's missed. So I think the one of the primary points, like you said, with de Tocqueville was that care for the neighbor, right? The fact that our lives are invested with each other.
There was also the thing in his time. We had a society for everything.
Yes.
Right? That was
absolutely.
the big word. And that's really dropped out.
Yeah.
I think up until the 90s, probably, you had, the local film society and the book society and the art society. And
So
we don't even call them that anymore.
Yeah.
The word's kind of gone out. But in de Tocqueville's time, there was a society for everything. And I guess now we think of them as nonprofits.
yes,
Right?
right, NGOs,
NGOs, yeah.
Which is a real shame because changing those, I think changing that verbiage, right? Words are important, and it makes it distant, right? It's a nonprofit that I give to. It's not a society that I'm a part of,
Right.
and that
Where
takes
I'm a member of the body.
Right.
I am one of the hands and the feet of the body, because this thing is inherently local.
Right.
And it's actually doing something that you can point to and see in your community.
yes. But I mean, you can get all that by watching church online. I mean, you can just have an online community is there, and I can be a part of whatever I want to be a part of because I have the internet now. Which obviously that's being said tongue in cheek. I think the internet has made us always connected and never more alone, right?
Yeah, but you caught the language I'm using.
Yeah.
Is inherently biblical. It's ecclesiology. What's the word?
Ecclesiological.
Ecclesiological. It's ecclesiastic. That's the word I'm looking for. It's ecclesiastic in that it's pointing to a deeper sense of identity.
Yes.
That a Christian has as being a member of the church. And what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And this, you can make such a strong parallel between the sense in which civic institutions and organizations in America have declined.
Right.
So, and there's a chicken and the egg thing, but I think it's as the church declines, the civic institutions decline.
Sure.
When people have a shared identity in their local church, that overcomes so many divides. You vote one way, I vote a different way. Okay. We still take communion together on Sunday. Right.
Or as Putnam talks about, we used to bowl together on Monday night. Right?
And we still serve together,
on the PTA. Yeah.
And we're doing things in our community for the flourishing of our town.
Right.
And I think today it's unfortunate. We're either too cynical or we're too utopian, right? The cynicism comes in where, this stuff doesn't work. We can't actually make a difference. I think this is where the federal government gets leaned on a lot because, what's the idea? The idea is that bigger is more powerful and you're going to see better results. And the more classical vision, which was also just more practical, is that local people have a better chance at knowing what the problems are and the best solutions are going to be. And the process is better because it pulls people into the life and the health of their community. And so everybody's taking greater ownership in their own backyard. And what you have at the end of the day is not just problems being solved, but a living, thriving, flourishing town knit together by all of these relationships between people choosing to come together in love and sacrifice.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a connection here. So I think we can see some things practically, right? So if you look at your neighborhood, the neighborhood you live in, look at how many garage doors you have versus how many front porches you have, right? And so there's been this historic shift of where life takes place, and it's no longer, hey, we're gonna. Even if you have a front porch, is it big enough to have a fan so that you can sit out there in the summertime,
or a chair,
of any kind? And we've eliminated a lot of the margin in our lives, right? And the reason, I think, a big reason why we've eliminated a lot of the margin in our life is because our economic policy is so horrible, right? So if your economy is not doing well, then in order to take care of your family, you have to work longer hours. You have to do more at the office. You have to strive harder. And so you come home more tired. You have less time with your family. You don't have time to go bowling, much less the energy or the interest, right? So what do? You come home, you unplug from the office. You to use the 90s phrase, you plug into the Facebook or to the internet, and you seclude yourself, right? And in a desire to relax and still be connected, you trade both. You start scrolling, and now you're comparing yourself to everybody else. You're comparing your family to the family next door. You don't have the relaxation that you're looking for. You get more stress, and you lose the actual connection that comes from spending time with one another. So I think there's been a real shift in our the housing market right now, right? For the last year and a half has just been insane.
That's killing me. I'd love to own a home.
Right? And
yet you're right. Not so long ago, a one income household was the norm.
Yes.
And that's almost inconceivable for
It
most
is.
people today.
But I think part of that too comes from our consumerism, right? So we say I have to have more. I have to have the big, like I say this sitting in a massive house compared to anything that I ever thought I'd own. But the reason why we're here is because of our family situation, right? And we have legitimate reasons for needing this size. But for most people, it's hey, I'm a newly married couple. I want a 3-bed, 2-bath house. I want what my parents raised me in at 22, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going to find a 1,000 square foot house that I can afford to buy and that I can afford to pay off, that I'm not going to spend $1.5 million on over the course of my lifetime. Right. And part of that is demand, is a market problem, right? Like those houses aren't available today, right? If you watch the show that my wife loves, notice I said that, so I'm not on the hook for watching it, is Hometown in Laurel, Mississippi, right? So in Laurel, they're buying a house for $75,000 that's 850 square feet, and they're flipping it, and they're all in at 150 grand, and it's a great starter home, right? It's a great place to start at and live your first years as an adult, building some equity, so that when you do start a family, you can build onto it and add to it or move. But those opportunities aren't there now, right? Like you can't go find a house like that somewhere close to a downtown where you can still walk to work.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons why I love the work that the people at Strong Towns are doing. If you haven't read Strong Towns, I highly recommend it to you. They also have a podcast. But we really need to do some work on reclaiming the way we develop economically, town centers, et cetera, to make these things doable again, right? But I think part of that is the demand has to be there. I think at some point you have to say, I'm not going to spend 5 times my income to buy this house that I want. I'm going to live with my parents for a little bit longer if they'll let me, and I'm going to save my money, and we're going to do it right the first time. And I think if more people did that, it would slow down that demand some. Now, obviously, not everybody has that luxury, and that's not an easy thing to do. But when you're looking at rentals and you're renting an apartment, and your apartment is as much as a mortgage, like it's not sustainable, right? It's not a sustainable model at all.
Right.
So all of that, I think, leads to what we were talking about a minute ago with the degradation of those mediating institutions, right? The Rotary clubs, the bowling leagues, the humane societies, and all of that. So I think if we can start to kick our consumerism a little bit, then that will help us be able to build a little more margin in our lives. We won't run up the credit card bills. We'll maintain our budgets a little better, and then we'll have the ability to come home from work at 5 o'clock and sit on the porch with our kids and reclaim some of that.
Right. Yeah, we are consumer nation. Mm-hmm. And that's going to bite us in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I think we've almost doubled the national debt within the last 15 years, 20 years.
Yep. And it just puts everyone at a different pace of life.
Yes.
Everything's frenetic energy. Everything is rushing to keep up. You stay overtime at work to keep up, to use,
right.
The metaphor you used. You go home, you plug into social media, and you see all the things other people are doing that you feel obligated
right.
to keep up with, and they're having better vacations than us, and
yeah.
they have nicer cars than us
right.
now.
Keeping up with the Jones.
Well, any barometer you want to use, everything's so, frenetic and competitive, and that's a very different approach to community.
It is.
That doesn't naturally bring people together at all. Mm-hmm. It tends to segment us even more and more. So
we would say that's a bankrupt version of a community, right? So I think if we look at these institutions, I think that's a good delineation to make. What is the right or real in the objective sense version of this institution, and what is the bankrupt and lie or the non-objectively true version of that institution that we're currently embracing, right?
Right. So
So let's talk about family, for instance, right? So we said the 3 institutions that were ordained by God, it was the family, and then the church, and then the government. And if I remember correctly, if I remember my scripture right, it's in that order, right? So let's talk about the family. What if we're going to reclaim the institution of the family? What would that mean?
To reclaim the family?
Yeah.
That just got a lot more complicated, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
We have to agree on definitions for one.
Right. Well, let's talk. And again, there's a million rabbit holes we can go down with this, but let's talk about definitions first, right?
Right.
Definitions are important because they have to line up with the objective truth of life. If right, we can disagree. Like TSL, you say, in order to know what something is, you have to know what it's for. We can disagree. We can disagree on the definition,
Right.
But I'm sorry, we can disagree on how it functions, but we can't disagree on the definition of it, right? We have to have that agreement of
To have a conversation.
Correct. Right.
Yeah, and so trying to step over a few, potholes and rabbit holes, thinking about this just in terms of your community flourishing and people from a variety of backgrounds and different perspectives and different opinions coming together, you do need to be able to agree on a certain amount of things.
Yeah.
I would say this is why the conversation around flourishing is so crucial. Mm-hmm. Because what is your picture of flourishing? The good life. What is that?
Yeah. What is the good life?
So at Hillsdale,
Great book by Colson. But anyway, sorry.
oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
At Hillsdale, there's an institution of sorts.
Yes.
the president of the college, Larry Arnn, he has this long-standing tradition of wandering around the lunch room, the cafeteria, right, the food hall, during the lunch hour, periodically when he's in town on campus, and he'll just walk up to freshmen and ask them, "What is the good?" And it's the most entertaining thing to see freshmen
Squirm.
ambushed with this question from the president of the college, and he just starts picking apart their answers and like, oh, so you assume that the good has something to do with this or that thing or whatever. And it's a critical question. It might seem like he's just bullying people, but he's not. I think he's actually getting down to what is most practical and important.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, we have to agree on a goal in order to work together as fellow citizens, members of community. And if you've got radically different pictures of what the goal is, that's a much bigger problem.
Right.
But assuming that you can begin to talk about what it is for society to flourish, I think it's because we understand the intrinsic good in certain virtues, right? We can draw encouragement, like C.S. Lewis pointed out. No civilization in the history of the world rewarded its cowardly warriors. Right. The ones that ran around and hid during the battle, or people that betrayed their friends and lied a lot. Like societies don't tend to glorify those kinds of people, because it in no way does it contribute to human flourishing.
Right.
So if we can identify the kind of place we want to live in, the kind of people we want to be, the kind of children we want to produce, the kind of generation we want to raise up after us, and the kind of world that we want to hand to that generation, it just requires a little more honesty than we're having. Because I do think that there's more agreement than not in general on these things.
Sure.
It's just that we're not having hard conversations. Like, we're not having, seriously, the conversation about what kind of world we want to leave to our kids.
Right.
Do we really want to leave them saddled under a $30 trillion debt? No, objectively, no.
Right.
And yet that's what we're doing, and we just don't think about it a lot,
Right.
and we kind of skirt that issue.
Yeah. I think I'd push on one phrase, a word that you're using. You keep saying, "What do we want?" I think we should be, and I think you'd agree with this. I think it's just a semantic thing. The real thing to ask is what ought we to do, right? Because freedom is not the ability to do what you want; it's the responsibility to do what you ought. I don't remember who said that, but I had a guy who said that if you forget where it's from, that's the truth of originality.
Right.
So I claim that quote as my own.
No, I
that's
love
not true,
that.
but it's the idea of what ought we to do, right? And I think that's part of the problem that we face with institutions today is, I think 15 years ago, we could all say we think the end goal is the same. We just disagree on how to get there. But I think we, in our ever increasingly polarized world,
That is changing.
right, the outcome is changing. And I think it's because we are now in not just a postmodern but a post-Christian society that outcome is different. And I think that's part of why it's really important as a part of this conversation for us to talk about the institution of the church. Because throughout history, Christianity has objectively benefited society, right? Christianity in its truest sense, in a non-heretical context, has always been good for the world around it. It's been good for the city, right? It has been for the life of the world. It's a positive thing, right?
Yeah.
The secular anthropologist, I think he's an anthropologist, Tom, what's his last name? Tom Holland, not the Tom
Yes.
Holland that played Spider-Man or
Right.
whatever. Anyway, not that Tom Holland, but the Tom Holland that anthropologist I think is what he is. Talked about women's rights specifically, that women would not have any rights if it wasn't for Christianity, and that Christianity was the first institution that said women have equal value and are not just property. And there's out there somewhere there's some lib that just got triggered and that says, but the Old Testament says no, like you have to look at the entire context of Scripture. So I think what you're talking about is really important of figuring out what ought we to do. What end do we want, right? So like with the family, it's no longer, it feels like Christians have ceded the battle for one man, one woman in marriage, right? This definition change has only been around for the last, what is it now, 10 years, 15 years, right? For literally thousands of
30
years before that.
seconds
Yeah,
in
for
terms of human
thousands of years
history.
before
Yeah.
that, no one ever understood the context of marriage outside of that context, right? And it's because you have to ask, what is marriage for? Marriage is for procreation. It's for the continuation of society. And you can't take two people that can't procreate and put them in a relationship and call it a marriage, because that's not what marriage is for. Now, we also have to, I think at the same time, you can very easily say, we hold no animosity towards people that practice homosexuality, right? Like as Christians, we disagree with them. We disagree with what they're doing. We think it's wrong, but we don't judge them on the same plane as I would judge you or you would judge me, because they don't claim to believe the same things, right?
Right.
So I think we can live in charity with them and still say, look, we want to help you. We want what's best for you. We want you to find happiness and all the things that you claim that you're trying to find in this relationship, but we can't let you say that this is what it is, because it's not.
Yeah. I mean, from the Christian perspective, our heart is burdened for all those who are far from Christ.
Yes, absolutely.
We're not looking at anybody with malice.
Right.
We're looking only at a world that is far from God and far from flourishing in Him. And I never want to, hopefully, no one is reducing that to a 1-to-1 ratio and
Correct.
it becomes a health and wealth gospel.
Right.
It's not that. It's being fully human, being fully everything we were meant to be, designed to be. That's where we find fulfillment and peace and joy. And that's also where the world finds justice. And all of these things come together in such beautiful ways. I'm glad you made the point you did about what we want. I use that language because we just happen to live in a democratic republic.
Sure. Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, as Americans, there's really no one but we can point the finger at and blame other than ourselves.
Right.
Right? For the systems that we have,
sure.
institutions or lack thereof that we have. And we have to take accountability, I think, for the choices that we have made and the choices that face us in the future. But you're absolutely correct. Freedom, truly understood, never is reduced to human whim. If that were the case, that's a very sad and pathetic view of freedom. That would just be, human temperamentism or whimsy.
It's a rule by the gut, right? It's what Lewis talks about. Lewis talks about in Abolition of Man, right? You have the head, which is your reason, your chest, which is your character,
exactly,
and
great illusion.
And then you have your gut, which is your want, right? And so
yes,
Chuck Colson, I think, had a great quote that ties into that. He says that humans have the infinite capacity for self-rationalization, right? So if you remove that character, if you say that you can be whatever you want to be, there's no objective moral standard. You can practice whatever you want to practice as long as it, as Thomas Jefferson said, doesn't pick my pocket or break my leg. Then you can do, and to modernize it, you do, right?
You, man. Yeah.
If you do that, then you create. Lewis said, we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We remove that character that binds us to what we ought to do for the good of our brother, for the good of society. And it allows us to make our own way. And that own way is 99.999% of the time harmful to everybody else.
Yeah. It's the surprise that you get when you declare independence and revolution from a tyrant outside of you, and you make yourself your own king.
Yes,
and then you
your own little
discover
tyrant.
that you are a tyrant
Yes.
unto yourself. And as Paul says, my flesh is out to consume me,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't trust it. It doesn't lead to my flourishing.
Yes.
I do that which I do not want.
I love that passage where I think it's I'm horrible with references, but I believe it's an Old Testament passage where it says that your heart seeks only to destroy you. Like, don't follow. Like, giving someone the advice to follow their heart is the worst advice you could give anyone.
I mean, what does that really mean? We think we know what it means because we say it a lot in Disney movies, I guess. But if we don't have a realistic sense of how fallen we are,
Yeah.
it's so easy to point out a tyrant outside of us. It's very hard to acknowledge when we're the tyrant. But like, what is a tyrant? We can point to a king that has no standard above himself.
Yes.
He does not yield
Yes.
to a sense of justice or duty or righteousness and how it is right and fair to treat the poor, etc. But he does what he wants
Yeah.
for his own sake. And yet we want to take that power dynamic and just take it for ourselves if we have a really poor definition of freedom. The prayer book defines freedom really well. It's true freedom is the service of God.
Yes.
And it's to live in his will. Because that's when we are actually being what we ought, as we ought. And it's a beautiful thing to see that version of humanity.
I agree. So sorry, there's a couple tangents in my brain right now, and I want to hit them both. So I love what you just said about how the prayer book defines that. Can you take that and apply it in a common grace manner for the non-Christian?
That's a great question.
Can you say, right? So we would say it's I think it was Herman Bavinck who said Christ, which you mentioned kind of in general, Christ's death on the cross is not only for salvation, but to make us more fully human, right? To be human is to be fallen, right? And that redemption came with Christ. So in that, we are forming and filling the earth now, right? We're redeeming everything. We're redeeming art. We're redeeming science. We're redeeming the human relationships that we have. We're seeking justice in the right way and all of the above. So how can we expand that for the non-Christian in a common grace mindset to say, even if we disagree on our view of God and our view of eternity, we can still be approaching and following a similar path, right? We can get back to both wanting that same end goal of truth, beauty, goodness, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think it's a good question, not just because we want to find non-Christian ways to say things in order to be more palatable to the world.
Right.
But more like being able to point out to people that this really is God's world.
Yes.
And you really do see him and his truth apply across all spheres and all, circumstances. And I think an easy way to see that is like going back to more natural law understanding of this.
Yeah.
And you see this when you read the pre-Christians like Cicero and in his stuff on natural law, or the Socrates and his dialogues, and Plato. At Hillsdale, there's kind of the big picture that you take of the West is like Socrates comes along, and this is so simplified.
Sure.
You got Socrates. What makes him special? Well, he's just one guy, pagan guy, Greek guy, right? But he has a sense of justice that compels him to push back against the sophists of his time.
Yeah.
Who are saying there's no such thing as truth or duty, honor, righteousness, justice, etc. There's only power. Words are tools to achieve power, and it's that simple. And we all just want to win at the end of the day.
And real quick, I think that's also that is the lie that just keeps on going, right? That might makes right. Absolutely, it's everywhere.
And there is no goodness.
In some very, very unique
There's only
ways.
power.
Yeah.
I think that's the saddest lie that so many people are buying into today, especially young people. If you're not handed a strong worldview, strong sense of right and wrong, but instead of this really tepid kind of relativism that is inherently incoherent, young people are smart enough to realize that's garbage. I can't actually live with that. So what do? I guess everything is just random at the end of the day, and the only thing that makes a difference is whether you have the power to, control, or I'm powerless and I will be controlled.
And that's what critical theory has kind of flipped on its head. And one of the reasons why it's so prevalent today is it says the more the lower you are, the more disadvantaged you are, the more power you actually should have, and the more power you do have over your aggressor.
Because that's the thing that you lack, and that's
correct.
Your savior, your salvation will be through rectifying that formula, that equation. It's like that's one dimension of a multi-dimensional equation.
Right. And it keeps
that
you in
worldview
that
is just blind to.
victimhood. Yes, and it keeps you in that victimhood mindset of, well, I'm a victim, so I should be listened to. It's the same, to get on the policy side real quick, it's the same thing, like anytime you have a school shooting, right? School shootings are horrific. And we need to do some serious work on that issue specifically. And I think a lot of that comes back to fatherless homes, but that's another talk for another day. I'm not advocating for gun control or metal detectors. I think there's some root causes there that we need to fix. But after those happen, you always have one or two victims that get pulled out of those scenarios, that then get put up as the poster children of the anti-gun movement, and they are now considered content experts on all of these things, when all they have is one single lived experience, right?
Yeah.
And while that one single lived experience is very unique, and it's very horrible, that doesn't make them an expert in that field. But we take that victim mentality of, oh, well, this person's a victim, therefore they should be listened to an extreme, right? All victims should be heard, right? You should listen to, hey, I have a problem with this. This person did this to me. I need to find some justice for this. The question is, one, is it a real claim? First off, and then two, how do we hear it and listen to it and act on it without blowing it out of proportion? Is basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think it reveals the way we think now in 2024 America. I mean, there's total epistemological despair, meaning no one knows what's true anymore.
Right.
That's why everything's up for redefinition, everything's up for grabs, and it becomes just a power battle.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I'm going to grab it and yank it in my direction, and you're trying to grab it and yank it in your direction. What a mess.
Right.
And whoever wins that way, if that's the way you fight the battle at the end of the day, it's going to be dark for everybody.
Yes.
You're not going to be a just ruler, right? So that epistemological despair, I think it speaks to the absence of hope and faith in our culture. And I know that can sound really generic, but it took a lot of hope and faith for the Founding Fathers to say, we actually believe that human rights are real, that certain rights are endowed to all men by their creator, that the fact that there is a God and he made all of us, that actually makes a difference in how we live. So today we lack a lot of that stuff, and we've defaulted back to a really wooden sense of like, well, what do you trust in? I guess your feelings. Right. And what's the most real feeling of all? Pain. Which goes to the snares that you drew forward. And so if pain is the most real and most trustworthy thing of all, that helps you in certain instances explain, like, well, we know the Holocaust was wrong because it produced a lot of pain and suffering. Okay. But what about just, parenting your kids and having to discipline them? Sometimes, so what do? Do you say, like, well, I guess what pain is not inherently bad? And, like, we don't have a way to really answer the question.
I think they are saying that pain is inherently bad, which is why we have so many kids that are just totally out of control.
Exactly. That's the point I was trying to make. Right. You can have a really one-dimensional roadmap to good and evil, right? And so, therefore, I'm never going to tell my kid that he has to brush his teeth because he doesn't like brushing his teeth.
Right.
Like, come on, that's not sustainable. So, but as Christians, I think we can make so much more sense of this by understanding, look, it is a fallen, broken world. That's why you have pain, suffering in the first place.
Right.
But we also have to be humble enough to acknowledge that we are part of the problem. Our flesh, we're not perfect. We are so far from perfect. And we have a fight to fight within ourselves. And that is inherently painful and uncomfortable. But that is what the good life looks like. And I mean, even if you go back to Plato, to kind of bring this full circle, Plato is not a Christian. He's not reading the Bible, but he's wrestling with these issues of justice. And he comes to the conclusion that it is far better to suffer injustice and bear pain than to be someone who perpetrates injustice.
Yeah.
And have that damage your soul and shape you and your legacy.
That's great points. I think there's, going back to the oughts, right? The goal should be what is best for this person, not just what is the most enjoyable for this person. So I think you said the most real feeling is pain. And I think culture would tell us that the second most real feeling is sexual pleasure. right? Which is
Yep.
why there's such a push for you to do whatever gives you that satisfaction. And the people that were considered alarmists 15 years ago on the gay rights issues have said, well, this is going to open up all kinds of things and it's going to be a slippery slope, and they were laughed out of the room.
Right.
And look at where we are. We're generally mutilating kids and saying that this is the good, true, and beautiful way, right?
Yeah.
And it's because we're unwilling to say, you need help in other areas, and this is a symptom, not a cause, right? For some people, and for some people, it's just a stage you have to grow out of, right?
Or even just, if you have a notion of the good, this goes back to the question, what is the good? Everyone's got an answer to that question. In a hopeless view of the world, where we're alone, we're ants on a space rock, everything is random, the only good worth pursuing is, I guess, pleasure, the absence of pain, power. Power to make sure that you have the pleasure that you want and aren't subjected to pain.
Yeah.
It's Nietzscheanism applied. It's a brutally ugly way of viewing the world. I think a hopeful way of viewing the world has God at the center of it, an actual understanding of the good. There is goodness in the world. It's worth fighting for. In the great words of Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings, there is some good in this world and it's worth fighting for. And that sounds so platitudinous. But what we're living through right now is like a conflict of visions of the world where, like, if you're not willing to just say something that simple, like there is some good in this world and it requires us to fight for it. That's how we begin to make sense of making sacrifices and putting ourselves in painful, uncomfortable situations to do things that we know are good and right for the benefit of ourselves and others. Build a better community, not run up trillions and trillions of dollars of debt, and not mutilating kids. And
Which,
how did we get here?
How is that now the crazy thing to say, right?
Yeah.
I think too, going back to the aughts, with children specifically, and the idea of the institution of the family, right? So the purpose of the institution of the family is to create and then mold the next generation, right?
Be fruitful and multiply.
Yes. Be fruitful and multiply, to form and fill. They go together extremely well.
Right.
And if we are going to do that in a natural law context, not necessarily biblical, but a natural law context, that still requires one man and one woman. Ryan Anderson from the Heritage Foundation said it very well. He said, there's no such thing as parenting. Mother's mother and father's father. And if we look at children and we say, what are children entitled to under the law? What rights do children have? Children, by the way they are created, have the right to a mother and a father, right? There is no other possibility for them to come into being, even if they're created in a test tube. The supplies created to make that are required to make them in the test tube still come from a man and a woman. And so I think for us as conservatives and as Christians that are starting to fight these cultural battles, I think that conversation has to shift from being anti whatever to being pro children's rights. And the fact that, you talk about you being the tyrant of yourself, right? If you are if you are a homosexual couple that says, I have to have kids, and if I don't have kids, I am not fulfilled, you're making it not about the child and not about what's best for the child. That decades of studies, non-Christian studies that have nothing to do with the Bible or Scripture or the institution of the church, have told us that kids thrive in a home with a mother and a father. They've historically called them two-parent households.
Yeah, there's no question about it.
But the two-parent households has not been redefined until very recently to include two women or two men, right? Yeah. So if we know that this is what's best for children, then when we take these non-fruitful relationships and we make them fruitful, either by surrogacy or by adoption or by whatever means, we are putting that child and robbing in a place where they shouldn't be, and we're robbing them of some of those essential rights that they have just by existing.
Yeah, it's the commodification of the family,
yes,
and especially the commodification of children. It's the reduction of life to a commodity as well, rather than a miracle, which God has stewarded to us to bring about in very specific scenarios, and within a covenant of love and lifelong marriage between a man and woman. I was very happy to see Pope Francis actually
Of
come
all
out really
people.
strong on surrogacy. And I mean, a lot of people aren't paying attention to this issue. So good for him.
Yeah.
And I think he's just actually providing a lot of clarity and truth to something that should be more obvious. But yeah, life is not for sale, whether that's slavery or whether it's the creation of children in test tubes or farming it out to surrogate moms and then shipping it out to, desiring buyers. No, there's something so inherently misdirected
Yeah.
and wrong, and man, we should see this coming. Come on, we're America. We're constantly talking about the horrors of slavery and how much we were implicit in that. Like, we obviously haven't learned the lesson in any regard. We're still trying to figure out the lesson in terms of how do we live together, as one people created in the image of God. We're doing a really bad job of that. How do we
Yes, we are.
acknowledge the humanity of all people created in the image of God? We still can't get it together on the abortion issue.
Yeah.
Really bad job learning the lesson there. Same thing here in terms of commodifying children and
Yeah, and I think
meeting demand wherever it is.
yes, and this is a tough one because the desire to have kids is a great desire, right? It is a very good thing. Children are a blessing. They're not a burden, right? And even I think a lot of Christian couples are unknowingly complicit in this because the church is not talking about these things. It's not talking about, well, one, it's done a horrible job of talking about contraception to begin with, right? And
oh yeah,
that's just
we missed that boat 100 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so then what's the natural outflow of that is? Well, then if we're not talking about that part of our family relationships, then if we can't have kids, then obviously God wants us to be fruitful and multiply. So we should do whatever we need to do in order to have children of our own. But at some point, your desire to do good will become harmful, right? Like, because now you're taking something that God is saying no and to wait on, and you're trying to take it into your own hands and do something different.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll hear the argument, like there's a lot of kids that just need a home, and they need someone to love them. And hey, you got this gay couple that wants to open up their home and provide shelter and peace and security and food. And that sounds wonderful. Like, how could you have a problem with that? At the end of the day, though, I think what's really at stake, the conversation we ought to be having is, it's kind of like you brought up school shootings.
Yeah.
Like, this is a symptom of a much bigger disease, and we have to follow that all the way back up to the well. And so what is going on that we have all of these broken homes and all these kids without their fathers in the picture? And why do we have so many kids that need adoption and need people intervening? At the end of the day, you will always have every single person, like you said, comes from a man and a woman. And that person is always going to be deeply impacted by the absence, the very felt absence of one or both parents. I've known many people who were adopted in my lifetime. And you know what? They'll always give a world of credit to their adopted parents, who oftentimes, are more family to them than anyone else. And yet I've also witnessed the very real hole that is always undeniably there. And the pain that is, the pain that arises from knowing that you have a father somewhere out there or a mother that you don't know. And there's no getting around that. So if we really want to talk seriously about loving children, raising up a healthy next generation, the answer, the optimal solution is very clear, like you said. It's mothers and fathers who have brought these children into the world, taking responsibility for them, embracing the freedom to parent, right? And that's not like do it when you want to on your timetable, but realize you were made for this. You were built for this, and this is nature taking its course. Lean into that in the right way. When we don't, and we follow our own appetites, we just leave trails of destruction that impact the people around us and the people in generations to come. And it's a tragic thing. We have to be able to address it at its core. And it always comes back to ordinary people, men and women, making choices. And I think it starts to go into not only the way we define freedom and our moral norms, but also like the radical individualism question.
Yes, that's a big one.
And whether I'm living for me today, or if I have this inherent sense of my vocation as a man and my call to be a father, my call to be a husband to this woman that I love, and to dedicate myself to her and to building a home with her and a family. That's the best part of life.
Yes, it is.
Like, if anything, the homosexual
good
couples
life,
are
yeah.
reminding us of that, right?
Right.
Like, that's what they're after. They would love to live out that same story, and you have a bunch of men and women just failing to embrace the freedom that they
Right.
have to do that and to do it well, because it comes with a whole lot of duty and responsibility. And if we're looking at the world purely through a power dynamic, rather than see the goodness and the fruitfulness of the family and children and all that, it seems like an unchosen obligation that's
Right.
imposing itself upon me, and it makes me really uncomfortable, and I'd
Yeah.
like to escape if I can.
Yeah, and it's I will do this when I'm ready at 50, right? And we have it's the rise and triumph of the modern self. I mean, we've taken the blessing and we've made it a burden, and we've just totally flipped our priorities, right? So and part of that too is going back to the absence of pain piece. These are lessons that we're both learning as young parents. But like, if you don't discipline your kids, then they are going to turn out to be tyrants, and they're going to be solely focused on themselves and their self gratification.
To their own destruction.
Correct.
Yeah.
And they're not going to mature as they should, right? So like the fact that adolescence now goes into your 20s is an absolutely ridiculous and shameful thing, right? Like you should be ready to launch out into the world by the time you enter high school, right? Like if you're not prepared for life by then you have missed the boat, right? Like, and that doesn't mean you have to have everything figured out. Doesn't mean that you have to not have any doubts or fears or concerns, right? But because that's just part of life. You never get rid of that. Doesn't matter how much money you accumulate. Doesn't matter how successful you become. You will always have those same nagging things in the back of your head. But are you prepared to take responsibility for your actions? That's the biggest question. And are you ready to see your life as a life of service to other people? Because it doesn't matter what position you take. That's what it comes down to.
Absolutely. I love the points you're making about the family and kids. I've been thinking a lot lately about the ways that radical individualism in our time just blinds us to certain obvious truths. Like one generation talking about another generation. This is what you see all over the place, whether we're making fun of boomers or boomers are making fun of millennials,
Sure.
or Gen X and Gen Y and there's Z. Like, it's all of these generations are taking pot shots at each other as though they have nothing to do with one another.
Right. There's no connection. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like just wild self-determination at play here. It's like, hey, boomers, you better take responsibility for these millennials that you're critiquing, okay? Right. You created them.
Yes.
You formed them. And millennials, this Gen Z thing, like they are going to be either a vindication of you and your legacy or the opposite.
Right.
And so on. So like, we need to be able to take responsibility for the people that come after us rather than cut ourselves off from them. And if we do take ownership for them and their success, I think that's actually the best way we can love them. If you're a parent and you get to this point where your children are just failed to launch, as they say, and living in prolonged adolescence, and you said that's a shame. And it is, but it's not like, oh, that's bad because society will judge you and people will look weird at you and stuff like.
It's just a missed opportunity.
It means that you had the gift given to you to love and steward this life and bring this child into the fullness of their humanity and to send them out to be a light to the world and a pillar of strength to raise up the next generation. Right? Like, the world is yours now. Take it and then raise up the next and pass the baton forward. And instead, they don't have a sense of how to do that. That leaves them in a really helpless, vulnerable state. And that's a tragedy for them. And if we love them, we hate to see them there.
Right.
So I think this comes back to the parenting choices and like, how do we actually gin up the courage to do uncomfortable and painful things?
Right.
If you love someone, you want to set them up to succeed. We're not setting up the next generations to succeed.
Right.
Giving new styles of, how we train our kids, how we indoctrinate them, how we think about morals or don't think about morals. Like, it's just so tragic the way we're not setting up young people to succeed at all, culturally speaking. And then we also don't take responsibility for it, but we just talk about that generation in the worst possible light, like it's their problem.
Right. Yeah, I think so. We have the blessing of being of having an intergenerational home, and it has been we have seen more benefit from it than I think we ever imagined we'd see, especially in the raising of our oldest daughter so far. It's been incredible. And my, the relatives that live with us have been incredibly generous to give up their freedom and to give up their radical individualism of retirement by the beach to come live with us. And it goes both ways, right? Recently, I was at a Republican gathering, and the topic came up about the strain on the EMS system that retirement homes can create, and how those retirement homes function currently, and how that system is broken. And so, I in my naivete brought up the idea of like the intergenerational home and like how much of a benefit that's been to me. And every person I would venture to say, I can't document, but I would venture to say that every person in the room that was over 50 looked at me like I had lost my mind. And that the government needed to do, and this is Republicans, that the government needed to do more for these centers, if you will. Like, no, like, you're a Republican. The government is not the answer, right? You as an individual in the family is the answer. If you're a conservative Republican, we can all agree. We should all agree on that.
I want small government in the things I don't care about.
Right.
But I need them to be big enough to do what I want.
Right. And so the idea, like, you can't. It has to be a two-way street, right? The older generation has to say, I'm willing to give up the solely post-1950 idea of retirement, that I'm going to go live on a golf course and I'm not going to do anything with my time but enjoy my luxury, to continue to invest in my kids and my grandkids as they will let me. And I will invest in that next generation. Like, your job is not done until you're dead. And I'm not saying you have to work your 9 to 5 till then, but there's so many ways to be actively involved in the creation of society, in the flourishing of society, and helping it function and work better by being engaged and by being accessible.
Oh, it's such a great story. Maybe one other thing worth mentioning on the family is the role that unchosen obligations plays in our life and exposes our cultural norms and values. Unchosen obligations. The family is the first place where these become apparent. It's the best example. Like, we didn't choose our siblings. They're just there.
Right.
And we have responsibilities to them. Parents don't, traditionally you don't choose your children. We're getting to a point where, like, designer babies are a thing. And it's scary, the new sets of choices that people are going to have to contend with. But the family should be the first example and the best picture of the fact that we are placed here not alone. We're not islands. We don't exist in a vacuum. We never could and we never should. We exist in community.
Right.
From the very start, we're placed here as helpless babies. They would absolutely die if it were not for other people caring for us and loving us unconditionally and sacrificially, without any reward, right, for many years to come. So that's the family, and it speaks to the fact that, we come in completely helpless and dependent, which also should humble us and remind us, like, we come in bearing a debt, actually.
Yeah, we do.
So by the time you're mature enough and strong enough to begin to pay that debt back to your family, your siblings, your parents, your community, like, why would you need convincing to do that? But that is not the way we think of it today. And in America today, I don't know, I was just thinking, how often do you hear sacrifice highlighted as an American virtue? Very seldom, and it seems like most of the time that I see sacrifice, now I do see it in certain contexts, but very specific contexts, and it seems like it's generally something where individuals make sacrifices for their individual gain. Like, we admire an athlete who dedicates himself to training day in, day out, obsessively, has to say no to, a lot of things in his life. And we'll give him a big pass, like, even if it's saying no to, his family and his marriage falls apart. But hey, he won the championship at the end. he made sacrifices
Yes.
to win, and he's a winner
Yeah,
now,
right.
right?
Yep.
Which is actually the complete inverse of what I wish we thought of when we thought about sacrifice. Now, I think that the exception to this is the immigrant story. Every American immigrant story is a story of sacrifice. These parents moved across the world, left everything behind, everything that they knew, all their
Right.
families and their social safety nets, came to a new place, sacrificed, learn a new language, probably pick up a new job, probably hard menial labor for the sake of their children, to give them a better life, because they had a clear vision of what that meant for their kids, and a better life for their kids, and a way for their kids to flourish. And they thought that was possible here. So they made sacrifices on behalf of another.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful thing. And I think that is exactly what America is about, because you need every generation to make sacrifices for the next generation.
Right.
You want every single American to be willing to, answer duty's call, whatever that looks like, whether it's, taking care of the homeless in your community.
Sure.
Responding to the draft when the nation's at war. Man, that's a controversial one now. No one likes the idea of a draft because,
Right.
Do I really consider myself liable, to the unchosen obligation to defend my country? People don't seem to be on that wagon commonly anymore.
And I think, I'll make a quick comment on the draft. I think a draft is actually a more equal way of distributing the cost of conflict, right? Because with a draft, you get people from high-income families, low-income families. It spans the entirety of the American experience. Where if you look at the all-volunteer army, the vast majority of the people that are involved come from a similar subsect of American life, right? They're middle to lower income folks,
Right.
that have great intentions, that their heart's in the right place, and we absolutely salute them for it. But when we go to war, those are the people that feel the pain, and it's not felt among everywhere else, which I think encourages a lot of that conflict that we see today. So that's another possibly
It
controversial
changes
statement.
the way the whole society votes and thinks
Correct.
about warfare.
Yes.
And who feels
It's
the
not my
pain?
kids. It's not my kids. It's the kids from Appalachia. It's the kids from North Georgia. It's the kids from Florida.
That's the downside to democracy, isn't it? Everyone
why
that
we're a
doesn't have
republic.
kids or is too old to get drafted gets to vote on whether we draft
Yes.
these other guys. Which is just, that's difficult. But again, if we had a shared sense of like, we're all in this together and we're all going to be asked to make sacrifices, and that's the only way that our community can flourish.
Yes.
And I should never assume I'm going to like be able to skate by and fly under the radar and never make sacrifices. It's not realistic. It's damaging to our individual souls. It hurts our families. It's damaging to the spirit of the country. Obviously, I don't want to sound too pessimistic either, but I just think what are our values today? It's very much, I'm going to succeed. I'm going to achieve all my dreams. I'm going to live my best life. I'm
Right.
going to be happy. I'm going to not be in pain. I'm going to have pleasure. And we don't seem to have a good category to talk about the necessary sacrifices that we ought to make for the sake of our family first and foremost. But even that is like a training ground for making sacrifices for our community and our country. So that's why I brought up unchosen obligations and the way that the family is, stage one of where this is cultivated and lived out. And where you see strong families, you see that par excellence. Unconditional love. It's a very rare thing. God happens to arrange us in families, I think not by coincidence, but
Yes. No,
to
absolutely.
force us into living out this unconditional form of love with people that we didn't choose, but we're just assigned.
Yeah.
And here you go. Take ownership for them. Take responsibility for them. Love them like they're your own self.
Absolutely. Well, I think we're going to take a break. I'm going to go get some more coffee, and
Good
then
idea.
we'll come back and we'll start talking about the institution of the church. Hey, everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast, and I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for Season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.